The Judicial Service Commission has concluded that what has been an eventful run of interviews for the next Chief Justice of South Africa position. So the credibility of the judiciary, issues around transformation among judges, and in fact a debate over the processes to be followed all took center stage at some point of each interview today. For more on some of the key outcomes that came from the week gone by, let's bring in Ropafadzo Maphosa, who's a researcher on a institution that deals with issues of the Constitution at the University of Johannesburg. Ropa, it's great to have you on the program. Thank you so much for making time. I wonder, yesterday we saw yet another marathon run of an interview with the acting Chief Justice, Raymond Zondo, in the hot seat. From the questions that were posed at the very least, did you get the sense that the public was able to ascertain who is actually best positioned to take up this job?
Morning, Ayanda, and good morning to your viewers as well. Well, Chief Justice Zondo's interview was definitely very interesting, and we saw a lot of grilling from the Commission. He even said at some point that his seat was extremely hot. And I think we got a sense of whether or not he is ideal as our next Chief Justice. He had an opportunity to clarify most of his controversial judgments, to elaborate on his work at the Commission. He had an opportunity to, elaborate on his qualifications. So I think we definitely have a clear view of whether or not he's suitable for this position.
Yeah. Questions emerged around the line of questioning, not only in yesterday's interview, but certainly in interviews throughout the week. What's your response to those who are, dare I say, surprised that people who are politicians sitting in the JSC bring forward questions with a political leaning? Does that in any way dampen the process, do you reckon?
I think it depends on what angle you really have to look at it from. I think when you consider the fact that some commissioners such as Advocate Darlin Pofu and Mr. Julius Malema are leaders of the EFF, some of their questions would seem politically motivated. But at the same time, you have to consider what the role of the JSC actually is. I mean, their role is to ascertain whether or not the next Chief Justice is actually qualified to take on this role. And that includes raising objections in the line of questioning. So we know that the JSC has received some objections to the appointment of Justice Raymond Zondo and Justice Mlambo. And so these are objections that had to be raised in light of the fact that submissions were made about the suitability of these two gentlemen to lead the Constitutional Court.
Yeah. A lot of time yesterday being spent, well, perhaps a lot of time, depending on how you see it, being spent asking the acting Chief Justice Raymond Zondo about meetings he supposedly had with the former President Jacob Zuma at a hotel. The acting Chief Justice responding by saying that, yes, the meetings took place, but he can't recall what those meetings were about. Was that the best response he could give?
Certainly not. I think it does not reassure the public, and it certainly left some doubts in the minds of the Commission if the comments that came from Mr. Julius Malema were anything to go by after that, because he said it did not make sense to him how our Justice Zondo could recall the days that he met President Zuma and where they met, but certainly can't recall the conversations. But I think maybe that was also a safe answer from Justice Zondo. I mean, he is in the running for the position of Chief Justice. It would be tricky for him to say something that will, put him at a disadvantage in terms of the responses that he gives. So it was certainly a safe answer, but I don't know how reassuring it was for the Commission.
Yeah, there's issues around the cloud of questions or the cloud of uncertainty that it leaves behind. You speak about, what might be in his advantage or not. Another big talking point was around the time limit that the acting Chief Justice actually has. On the one hand, he's the most experienced because he's been in the Constitution for the longest, at least among the 4 candidates that were interviewed this week. But on the other hand, he's only got 2.5 years left in the Constitutional Court until he has to retire. How do you reckon the JSC will negotiate those two seemingly conflicting realities?
That is really an interesting question. It would be, it's very tricky because at the same time, you don't want to disqualify a suitable candidate, what may be the most suitable candidate, simply because he won't be able to serve more than 3 years in this case. But we also have Justice Matlanga. He also has 3.5 years left at the Concord. So I honestly think the key question here for the Commission should be whether or not the elected Chief Justice will have time to implement his vision. And you'll see that was one of the questions asked yesterday, whether there will be enough time to implement the vision that was stated yesterday during the interview. And according to Chief Justice Zondo, he would actually be able to, carry out his vision. He believes that part of the constitutional court set up at the bench is such that judges are able to carry on each other's duties even after one particular judge leaves or retires. And so he believes that even in the case that he was unable to implement his vision, there would still be room for other judges that come before him to carry that out.
Yeah. Depending on who you are and your position in society, many of those who are watching those interviews throughout the week gone by have had several objections, might I say, at different stages. Is there scope, room, recourse for actually challenging the process that was followed by the JSC in conducting these interviews? Or is it a foregone conclusion? We all just have to wait for the outcome of this process.
I would say it is a foregone conclusion, and maybe we should just wait for the outcome of the process. The way that the JSC conducts its interviews has always been questioned. I mean, you'll recall that last year, some interviews had to be redone because of some issues that arose after interviewing judges last year. And so I think we would want to avoid such a situation again, considering that there is a vacancy in the Constitutional Court. And I don't think any delays at this point will do the country any favors.
Yeah. There's a press briefing at around 12 o'clock. We don't really know what the JSC is going to say at that press briefing once it begins. But, of course, we'll carry it live here at Newzroom Afrika. The reality is that it's still the president's prerogative, right? It's the president ultimately who's going to decide on which way he actually goes about this. From your vantage point, should that decision be followed with an explanation at the very least, given what we saw this week, and of course the stakes?
Absolutely, Ayanda, because there's already objections that the whole process has been politicized, and I think the country will need reassurance that the president is not simply electing his chosen candidate on the basis of the basis of politics, or that this is a politically motivated decision. I think it would be great to hear from the president why he is electing the candidate that he feels is suitable to lead the Constitutional Court.
Yeah. It would be remiss for me not to ask you a question around an issue that was brought up consistently from Tuesday till yesterday, and that's to do with this matter of transformation within the judiciary itself. One woman candidate obviously being interviewed in the last week gone by. Do you reckon the interest around transformation gives her a particular advantage?
To some extent, it might, because you will recall that one of the main questions that every single candidate was asked was whether or not the country is ready for a female Chief Justice. To some extent, that may indicate that maybe the Commission itself is not entirely convinced that the country is ready for a female Chief Justice. So I think in this case, Justice Maya's gender could work to her advantage or her disadvantage. She clearly stated that she wishes to be considered solely on the basis of her credentials, not because she's a woman. And I think if the Commission is to consider her credentials, they will realize what an incredible Chief Justice she would make. I mean, she has been leading the Supreme Court of Appeal splendidly for over almost 15 years now. So I think her credentials on her own should speak about her suitability for the position.
Yeah. Again, depending on your own vantage point, many have questioned even how the JSC is constituted, whilst others have said what we've seen in the week gone by is just constitutionalism in action. Doesn't mean it's perfect. What's your view?
I think there is room for improvement, Ayanda. I often think that maybe the call for gender equality in the judiciary has been lip service, but there are also people who are really trying to, make room for women in the profession. And for the DSC as well, it seems very concerned with the number of black people that are in the profession and the number of women that are in the profession. So these are questions that kept coming up. And, most of the candidates in question talked about what they have done to improve transformation within the profession. So we've seen Justice Mlambo talking about how he has tried to make room for women at the legal aid. One of the candidates also mentioned training judges to show up at the labor court. And so there's really room for improvement, especially within the JSC itself. But I think the JSC actually needs to consider making practical measures instead of simply just asking questions or just talking about transformation. Practical steps actually need to be taken that people can see transformation in action.
A researcher for the South African Institute for Advanced Constitutional Public Human Rights and International Law. All of that at the University of Johannesburg. Ropa, once again, thanks very much indeed for your time.